well, what is growth? We use this word. We have a set of labels and a set of meanings we apply to growth, but what truly do we mean by growth? We're looking to these kind of quantifiable metrics, and it's not that they're wrong. What I'm hoping to be able to end up with is a new image, a new metaphor for growth that kind of captures the fullness of the human experience. It's not that growth is bad. I just think it's only part of the story.
Hello, and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Eric Chakowski. I'm one of the worship directors here at First United Methodist Church, Richardson. And with me every week is one of our associate pastors, Josh Fitzpatrick. Josh, good day to you.
Good day to you, Eric. It is a good day.
It is a good day.
You know, this is the last episode of season 2, which is kind of crazy. I mean, we've had a fun time. It's been a great season.
Really great season. We've had all kinds of different people. We've had theologians, we've had podcasters, we've had pro athletes, and just all kinds of folks from different walks of life, and had a ton of fun having conversations with them.
When I stop and think about it, the variety of people that we've been able to have on the show this season is just, it's so fun. From Thomas J. Ord, who's just this deep theological conversation that left me with a page full of notes, to Ryan Hollinshead just a couple of weeks ago playing pro soccer for FC Dallas, and Laura Beal with 30 million downloads on the Dr. Death podcast. It's just been so fun to have the variety of conversations that we've been blessed to have this season.
We hope that you, as the listeners, have had as much fun and joy as we have listening to these stories, themes, and questions of faith from so many different kinds of people. We are thrilled about Season 3, which will be starting up this fall. Our season premiere of Season 3 will be interviewing Cowboys great Drew Pearson, the original 88, and we are so excited to talk to him to kick off Season 3. So we hope that you will be back with us when we start that, but we've got one more episode for today, and it's a fantastic one. We are thrilled to welcome Len Wilson to the conversation. Well, we are here today with Len Wilson. Len is the Creative and Communications Director at St. Andrew United Methodist Church in Plano, which is in the Dallas area here. Len is passionate and gifted in the areas of creativity, storytelling, branding, strategy, and does a ton of national work as a clinician and speaker. So it's an honor for us to have you today, Len. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I gave just sort of the flyover, but would you give our listeners a little bit of context for just the journey that you've been on sort of to get to where you are today and how that plays into the work that you do?
Sure. Well, I grew up in church. My dad's ordained United Methodist. His dad was a Methodist lay speaker, so it's kind of seeped into my bones. Been around church my whole life, but a lot of my experiences growing up in church weren't fully positive. So have you ever been in a service and there's something that's happened or some image you've seen or some word or phrase, and you just have no idea what that is, and you feel confused, you feel lost, and as a result of that, you feel kind of disengaged from the process? I felt like that a lot growing up, like just going through church, didn't understand church, and it created in me this desire coupled with kind of a natural creative spirit within me to bridge those things and to use my creative energies to help first understand what the language and symbols and rituals of church are, and then to be able to communicate those in a way that are helpful for others. So that's kind of been my driving journey for most of my life.
Yeah.
Now, you're not from Plano originally. What brought you to Plano, and where were you prior?
Sure. My dad is ordained in what was called the Louisville Annual Conference in Kentucky. So grew up in a lot of small churches in western Kentucky when I was a kid. He had been in active duty. He was a colonel in Nam, served 2 tours there. And so after 10 years of, how he politely says, fighting over what color to paint the fellowship hall, he went into chaplaincy work for veterans. And so it brought us to Texas so he could work in the VA hospital system here. So junior high, high school, college, I was here in Texas, graduated from Temple High and McMurray, a little school in Abilene. Then ended up kind of traveling around, got my seminary degree in Ohio, spent some time at a big church up there and back and forth. So I've lived some places.
We're glad you're back in Texas.
Yes, sir.
So I mentioned just in the flyover, but much of the work that you have done along the way has been wrapped up in storytelling and creativity. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is about those subjects that draws you to them?
Well, I think, when it comes to creativity, it's actually universal. When I lead workshops, sometimes I'll ask people, if they think of themselves as creative, raise your hand, and you get a little smattering of hands here and there, which is kind of tragic and sad because there's a creative spirit within all of us, but it's been beaten down, and so people don't understand how to tap into that and how that relates to their faith and into their mission work as well. We had talked a little bit ahead of time about my book, Creativity, Think Like a 5-Year-Old, I wrote a few years ago. And I told a story in the opening part of that book about a longitudinal study that was done at NASA in the 1960s. And at the time, NASA executives were desperate to find kind of out-of-the-box thinking related to the mission that JFK had set for that agency. And they were looking for engineers who weren't just solving problems that already existed. They were trying to find engineers who could solve problems that they didn't even know yet what they were. And so they hired a sociologist. His name was George Land, and he constructed this test to figure out creative thinking. So they started giving it to the engineers, and the test proved very successful. They were able to find, of course, if you just go by the results of what happened, they got engineers in there who could really solve their problems. What's interesting, though, is that George Land later, he's a sociologist, later he took that test and applied it to 5-year-olds. He wanted to see, if you took that same kind of creative questionnaire. And so he gathered 1,600 5-year-olds together, and he had this kind of, this grading scale. And 98% of those kids that took that test graded out top, max, genius, according to what he did.
Wow.
So they processed this, they published about it. A lot of conversation in the sociological community around this in the late 60s. 68 is when that came out. 5 years later, they did another study, and he did the same kids. So it became a longitudinal study, brought back the same group cohort, 10 years old, and they gave the same test. 30% were considered genius.
Wow.
And they did it again at age 15, 12% were considered genius. Then they brought the same cohort back at age 31, it was down to 2% were considered creative genius. So, what happens in that system? And of course, a lot of people have written and talked about our educational system and kind of the things that are in place. And of course, there's things that have been happening in the last 15 years with No Child Left Behind, which I think makes it worse. But the tendencies towards stripping out this kind of natural curiosity and creativity have actually been present, in our system for a long time. So the book was kind of written to respond to that from a theological perspective, kind of think through a theology of creativity and what that means, and then how can we begin to recover that. My whole first part is called I Had It, But I Lost It, because the whole kind of thing is we have this kind of innate creativity, and then there's this period, and I think it actually happens around 10 years old. There's things that happen there that take it out of us.
Well, so you kind of answered my next question, because I was thinking to myself, obviously some people are more creative than others, but what you're saying is suggesting that at the age of 5, if 98% of people are scoring in this genius creative level, were we all equally creative at one point?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah. And if you interpret Genesis the way I think you should interpret it, that we're all worthy, that we're all made in God's image, that means we're all creative. We all have that divine spark within us. But there's things that happen. In fact, in educational systems, they've marked it around 4th grade, between 3rd and 5th grade. There's a thing that happens. And I bet if you have any educators who are listening to this, if they're in late elementary, they're going to raise their hand in the car and be like, yeah, because you see this happen. And I've seen it happen to every single one of my kids. There's a tendency to become obsessed with approval dynamics, both vertically to authority figures and horizontally to peer groups. And so we stop being so free about our ideas and we start filtering ourselves based on how we think people are going to respond to those ideas. And then we internalize that so much over time that we stop even having the ideas because we're just, people aren't going to like it. And if you sit in a room, in a meeting, you can hear people do this to themselves. They'll caveat everything. Right?
It's not a good idea.
Yeah, you may not like this, or this is just an idea, or they'll do that kind of stuff because that's that dynamic that starts in us when we're late elementary age that's still playing out as adults.
So, Len, that's fascinating to me. I think oftentimes in creative brainstorming sessions with teams, the tendency is, at least when I'm leading them or when I've seen others lead them, we've got these things we tell ourselves, there are no bad ideas, get the bad ideas out on the table so that maybe they'd bring us to the good ideas, and these tricks that we sort of play on ourselves to maybe try to bring us back to that place. I was struck also by your commentary around NASA. So I have a music degree, and it's possible that they were just sort of affirming our track in college. But one of the things that they mentioned to us was, even if we don't pursue music, that there are a lot of companies and organizations that are looking for creative arts majors because of the way that they think. So as you talk about, NASA specifically looking for engineers that weren't just problem solvers, but were creative in the way that they think, it sort of drew me back to, this is really a common theme in our society, that creativity is being looked at in a new way and valued differently maybe than reading, writing, arithmetic that once sort of held that high place in what we value in education.
Yeah, absolutely. At the time I was writing this and doing a lot of research, the number one TED Talk of all time was by Sir Ken Robinson, who had done a lot of education research. And I think it's titled Changing Education Paradigms. And what's fascinating, if you Google this, instead of the TED Talk, I'd recommend you actually look up the kind of explainer video version of it. It's by a company called RSA Animate. And they reduce the talk down to about 8 or 10 minutes, and they've got a whiteboard guy behind it, drawing these things. And it captures so much, I think, of the problem, that little short clip. It's one of my favorite things to show. What he says basically is that we are operating off a 200-year-old model of the mind. It all came up in the early 1800s in an era of industrialization when we were trying to maximize production and efficiency, and so we have this kind of mental image of a conveyor belt, and we're going to bring in these kids and we're going to educate them and spit them out, and the drawing actually shows these kids coming off the conveyor belt with little tassels and stuff on. But I think it really kind of captures this idea that we're going to mass produce educated people, which of course now we've realized is a horrible idea, because what happens is you strip out anything that's unique and uniquely gifted in each one of us, right? And so we're kind of creating according to a template. We're all Model T people or something. And so Ken Robinson identifies that. And that talk, I think that talk's now been replaced by one by Daniel Pink. I'm not sure about that, but that's still one of the top TED Talks of all time because he really captures an issue that has been defining, I think, for this decade.
So Eric and I both have young kids. I've got a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And so I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, well, golly, I mean, our kids are in the public school system and we love our public school system, but what can we do as parents to supplement that education system that encourages that sense of creativity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've been experimenting real time with my 4 kids. So they're a bit older now. My oldest is 17, my youngest is 10. But throughout this decade, I've been looking for opportunities at home to develop divergent thinking because the school system has convergent thinking. Like there's a final answer, it's a single yes answer to everything. And divergent thinking is possibilities thinking. So instead of saying there's one answer, you say, well, there's 20 answers. And so I've done crazy stuff over the years. Like we'll sit at the dinner table. That's key. You have to be at the dinner table a lot to do this.
That's good.
Pick up a fork and be like, let's think of 20 uses for a fork besides eating. And so we'll just kind of brainstorm and do crazy stuff like that.
Yeah, that's great.
Just to kind of encourage. And I knew, and this is going to make me sound like the best parent ever, and I don't mean for that, but I knew some of this kind of stuff was working. Like I came home from work one day, oh gosh, this was 5-6 years ago, and my kids were having a film production meeting in the entryway of the house. So they had a board, and my oldest, she'd had a script. Some of the other kids had been drawing storyboards, and they were talking through this film. And they've been doing this. So my sister has 4 kids also. They're around the same age, a little bit younger. My poor mom, but we had all these kids kind of coming up at the same time. And so every 6 months when we get together with my sister and her family, they make a film. So this is kind of a routine that's happened, a tradition that's developed. And we'll shoot it with, Apple equipment and edit it together. And so they were actually pre-producing one of those films that day when I walked into the house. So
it helps to have a creative person at the helm with the ability to ask these questions about how do you view a fork in 20 ways. For those of us who aren't as creative as yourself, I think your next book needs to be how to start creative conversations with your kids, how to cultivate creativity in your children. Because
Josh will only take 20% for the idea.
Okay.
Yeah. That's my royalty. I love it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So let's jump to storytelling, another place that you spend a lot of energy. Let's just start on the really broad level. What makes a great story?
Well, there's a lot of different story structures and definitions for story. One of my favorite ones is by Don Miller, and he talks about stories are based on a character who wants something and can't get it. That's universal, right? So if there's something in your life and you want to have it and it's not there for you, no matter what that may be, then you're living a story. And so the story structure is when you introduce a character and they've got a problem. They can't solve the problem on their own. And so a sage or a wise person comes into their life and gives that person a plan. And then they execute that plan for good or for bad, depending on if it's a good plan or an evil plan. And most stories basically have that structure. I mean, of course, it's layered. You might have like that happen like 10 times over the course of a film, but that's basically what a story is. And that's basically what our lives are.
So in the conversation about story, you have written a book called Digital Storytellers, The Art of Communicating the Gospel in Worship. So tell me what part storytelling plays in a worship service.
Let me give some context for that book. When I had graduated from seminary at United, one of our Methodist seminaries in 95, there was a large growing Methodist church up the road in Ohio with a funny name. It's called Ginghamsburg. And it was one of the first churches in the country, at least in our Methodist tradition, to put a screen in worship. And they did this like December of 94 in a new facility at the last minute. It said, we're going to put this huge 16 by 20 foot screen up right behind the chancel stage area. And for like 5 months, they didn't know what to do with it. They were treating it like a broadcast. They actually had cameras in the room, and they were like projecting people in the seats in worship onto the screen.
Like a Jumbotron at a game.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like Kiss Cam. Exactly. Yeah. And so they hired me in that spring of 95, to say, help us figure out what to do with this. And so it was an amazing opportunity because I got to figure out real time how to use this mechanism to communicate. And I think visual communication is an inspirational, it's a storytelling medium primarily. And so we just started experimenting on a weekly basis what that looked like and what that meant, to capture stories and to produce those and tell those. And a lot of this was with analog equipment. It was, mid-90s at the time. And the reason for me is, and this goes back to what I said initially about growing up and not understanding the rituals of communication. I could get really kind of deep in the weeds here with theory with you about this. But the idea is that we're living a story, that kind of the grand narrative, if you've ever read N.T. Wright or things like that, there's kind of this biblical narrative that we're all living out of, and that we're all many versions of that grand narrative, with our individual lives. And when we structure the gospel as the Jesus narrative or the Jesus story and give people opportunities to make connections in their own lives to Jesus's life, there's a level of meaning that happens there that far surpasses kind of the propositional, empirical approach that we've been given by the Enlightenment that we use so often when we're talking about church and talking about Jesus.
So it strikes me that as we're thinking intentionally about how to tell Jesus' story well, we had a podcast a few weeks ago where we talked about engaging multiple senses in the worship service. Can you speak a little bit to your experience there at Ginghamsburg Church with the visual element of storytelling and why the visual sense is so important?
Right. Well, a little bit about that sensory experience. So there's a brain researcher named Ian McGilchrist, and he talks about right hemisphere, left hemisphere thinking, and that the right hemisphere is the hemisphere of embodied experience, sensory experience. And it's the first thing that we encounter. Pre-modern people only lived in this world as a concrete world. You would have sensory experiences, and so your meaning was entirely lived in that kind of sensory world. The left hemisphere is where we categorize and make references. We develop patterns, so it's a way for us to process and make sense out of that right-brained world that we have. So if we have a word that seems really disconnected, like we'll say prevenient grace. Okay, so that's a really theological word. If you've grown up in the Wesleyan tradition, you have an understanding of it. But if someone comes into your church here, to my church, and maybe they grew up Baptist and they're like, huh? And they have no idea what that means, then we have to go through a lot of theological explanation to help people really, truly grasp that. And to do that, you have to step back and engage people in the right hemisphere of their own sensory world in order to be able to make sense of this kind of abstract concept that we have. And McGilchrist, what he says is that one of the problems in our society today is that we're only living in the left brain world of categories. And so we're fighting over categories and we're fighting over definitions. But if we would bring that back into the right brain world of human experience, then we would find commonality that would enable us to overcome so much the division that we have whenever we're using labels, because we bring different understandings and meanings to those labels, right? So if we can bring it back to the sensory world, that's where we find commonality.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Okay, so you're working on your doctorate.
Yes.
And so I want to dive into that work just a little bit more. So your dissertation is primarily focused around growth. Is that correct?
Yeah. There's some backstory here. So let me step back into my own history a little bit. So I was at Ginghamsburg. I'm at this church in Ohio, and we're experimenting like crazy. My senior pastor, Mike Slaughter, he'd always talk about it as a living laboratory. And so every week we're producing something. And, most of the time, if you attend church on a regular basis, most churches have series, right? So you have like a 4 or 6 week series. We were not that smart. We were doing an entirely new production with new graphics, new videos, new stories, new songs, everything every single week.
Wow.
And so after 5 years of this, we were all kind of toast, And I left there in 2000, and I was starting to consult and teach about this, and did that for about a decade, just traveling around different churches. And the whole time I was writing. So I was publishing with our Methodist imprint, Abingdon Press, and putting out, various books and stuff. And so in 2010, I was going to write a book on story, in fact, and I pitched it to my editor. He said, actually, would love for you to come in and work at Abingdon. And so I made the choice at that time to go in and actually work in the publishing house for a couple of years as it's called acquisitions editor. So basically the gatekeeper. It's the person who chooses what books get published. So that's kind of this whole conversation we could have about the publishing industry too, if you want. But one of the things I was asked, if you talk to a clergy person or a church professional, if they've heard of Abingdon, they've usually heard of it in the context of like a 50-year-long trend called church growth. And it started in the 60s, and the most famous author is Lyle Schaller, and he wrote just dozens and dozens of books about how to grow churches. And after he retired, and due to several other factors, Abingdon's product line for books to pastors had declined significantly. So my boss at the publishing house asked me to rejuvenate that product line. He said, basically, find a new line of Adam Hamiltons and Mike Slaughters and people who can write and speak and kind of lead these conversations nationally. And so I started doing research. And I got all the information from different Methodist agencies. And so I started this huge spreadsheet, and I kind of figured out, like, okay, what churches are growing, what churches are declining, what kind of, I just started quantifying. This is 2010, before data became like the thing, that it is now. And so I did all this work. And so one time on my blog, I actually published a list that said top 25 fastest growing United Methodist churches. I just, on a whim, just kind of threw it up there. Had no idea. It's the most viral thing that's ever happened on my blog. It just it went national. Everybody's kind of having these conversations and, wow, look at this church. And what are you doing? You shouldn't rank churches. And so there's all these kind of things that are going on. And basically because of market pressure, I've been publishing that list ever since. I kind of sort of have an interest in it, but my motivation behind that list was to figure out why churches grow. What happens? What makes a church explode in growth? Because at Ginsburg, we had exploded in growth. We went from 1,000 a weekend in worship to 3,000 a weekend in less than 2 years. That was all organic in venue, not online. This is actual, true people in the room growing. And I think that's the biggest explosion of growth that's happened in the Methodist Church in the last 40 years. And so, I'm asking questions. Why did that happen? What's going on? And so it leads to bigger questions. Eventually it led me to the question, well, what is growth? We use this word, just like I was talking about left brain, right brain. We have a set of labels and a set of meanings we apply to growth, but what truly do we mean by growth? And so that's what led to my dissertation, which I'm halfway done writing at this point, so I'm pretty excited about it.
So would you give us the 2-sentence flyover definition of how you would define growth?
What I'm trying to do with it is talk about what I call deep metaphors. And I say there are deep metaphors in our lives that frame how we understand and think about things in ways that are subconscious, that we never even question or never even talk about. And I think what we talk about when we say the word growth is actually a secular ideology of the Enlightenment called progress. It's not biblical. It's this idea that there's incremental, inevitable improvement that happens. And it could be improvement in people. It's usually quantifiable, improvement in our budgets. The 3 famous B's of pastor life. What is it? Butts, budgets, and buildings. So there's this kind of thing that we're doing that's improvement. And I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind. In fact, as I was digging through this was a huge mind blower, huge Holy Spirit moment, in fact, is what it was. I was looking at the Great Commission in Matthew 28:19, when Jesus says, go out into all the world and make disciples. I actually think that's a bad English translation. If you look at that, the word make is an English addition. The Greek equivalent of make does not exist there. The word is disciple as a verb. We've turned make as the verb and disciples into the object. In the same way, Sir Ken Robinson was talking about producing models of the mind. You spit out kids. So when you say make disciples, that actually implies that it's a widget or a product like anything else we produce in this world. And there's actually a place in which you'd be finished. But if you look at Jesus' model, there is no end deadline. It's a constant lifelong process, sanctification. So it's a different way of thinking about things.
So disciple becomes the verb.
That's right.
Rather than making disciples as a noun.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So when you then were doing your research on Ginsburg growth, was your mindset different?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this has all changed for me.
And so what changes then when we look at the metrics that measure success in our churches? If 20 years ago, growth was the metric driving the conversation, what are we looking at today?
What's fascinating to me is that we intentionally began to adopt what I think are growth strategies around the time that we peaked as a tribe. So 1965 is the high point in membership for the United Methodist Church, and of course at its time it was its predecessor. It was the Methodist Church plus the EUB denomination. We've been declining every year, pretty much nonstop for 50 years. It's about that same time that we began to adopt strategies for how to grow. There's this huge disconnect that no one talks about. We've been trying to strategically grow for 50 years while we've been declining for 50 years. Clearly, it does not work to take on kind of corporate business models and strategies in order to be able to grow the church.
So then when we look at if growth isn't buts, what does growth look like in this new definition of growth? And then what metric do we use to measure success in the church today?
Yeah, see, this research is going to get me fired. It's very like subversive.
This is so good, though.
Because it kind of throws up on its end, kind of the typical ways in which we all do church. And it's systemic. It's how we're taught to do it. Our frameworks for success are based on it. The denomination looks to it, but we're looking to these kind of quantifiable metrics. And it's not that they're wrong. What I'm hoping to be able to end up with is a new image, a new metaphor for growth that kind of captures the fullness of the human experience. It's not that growth is bad. I just think it's only part of the story. Augustine uses the metaphor of a single human life, and all the progress scholars reject it after about age 30 or 40 because they say, no, you don't have the aging and decline, but there's that little kind of inconvenient part of the back half of human life in which we age, decline, and die. The progress narrative says, no, there's no such thing. We just keep moving onward and upward. But if we as Christians believe in the resurrection, then we know that aging, decline, and death isn't the end of the story. So maybe growth is one part of it. And if you look at the single human life, you've got periods of growth, right? You've got puberty, you've got adolescence, you've got full maturity. You also have periods of decline and death. Luckily for us, that's not the end of the story.
Wow. Man, you got my mind going. I can take this in like 20 different directions. I need to temper my own thoughts. I could talk to you for 10 hours, I think.
I'm giving you kind of this is very nonlinear.
I cannot wait to read your dissertation. I'll say that.
And your next book that he's making 20% of.
That's right.
Yeah. Actually, you got to get in line because what I'm going to do there's two portions. I'm going to do a shorter dissertation, and then I'm hoping to write a more popular book around growth instead, so it's not going to be so academic and
more
dry.
accessible.
So,
Great. That's cool.
Yeah, so that's good.
Well, we could certainly talk to you for 10 hours, but we have one question that we ask every guest that comes on the podcast. And that question is this. At this point in your life, what is one thing that you wish somebody would have told you?
So I was thinking about this at lunch. My son and I are having lunch before coming over here, and I was thinking somehow I was either never told this or I was too dense and never picked it up. But I was thinking about, and this gets back to these growth images, I was thinking about the power of connection and how our society is so extremely individualistic and that we really don't have a framework for what it means to be in covenant relationship with one another. So about 7 years ago, I got really serious about scripture reading. I kind of had a second conversion, and I've been just kind of pouring into scripture as often as I can every morning. And one of the things that floored me a few years ago when I was reading Exodus was I felt like that when Moses entered into a real relationship with God, that God slowly began to reveal the essential characteristics of God to Moses over the story, over the narrative of Exodus. And if you read it from beginning to end, you see kind of this growth to the point where Moses understands him and adopts him so much, he kind of throws him back in God's face towards the end when he says, you can't do that because that's not who you are at one point. And one of those essential characteristics is this Hebrew idea of hesed, this covenant love. The world says there's this kind of transactional approach. Let's negotiate terms for our relationship. You don't actually say this, but this is what people do, right? And so you try to find mutual benefit out of that. And in fact, I think the concept of consent is the best the world can get because it's it's a mutually affirming transaction. But that's not the same as covenant. And if you're really going to understand growth and you understand the decline and death part of growth, there's periods in your life when you're going to be pouring into someone without getting anything back, right? And that's what true covenant is. It took me a long time to figure that out. grew up in church, was around church my whole life, but it wasn't until I was up near 40 before I truly began to understand what that fully meant, the idea of covenant.
Well, and I wonder, too, if that's because covenant's one of those sort of abstract thoughts that maybe is a bit more right-brained than left-brained.
Yes.
And so that may be a difficult concept for us to grasp.
Yeah, right. We could see it. And this is where story is, right? Because you can see it. And I thought of at lunch, I thought of Nancy Reagan for some reason. I was thinking, like, the last 10 years of Ronald Reagan's life, did you ever see this? Like, she basically took care of him. I think was it Alzheimer's he had, I think?
Yeah.
And he disappeared for 10 years from public life before he died. And after he died, these stories were coming out about how Nancy Reagan had been by his side for those 10 years. And I just thought of that for some reason at lunch. And I was writing some notes to myself and thinking, that's what covenant is. It's that kind of relationship,
Wow. Well, Len, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
As Len defined what he believed made a great story, he quoted Donald Miller. Donald is another very well-respected storyteller and author. He has written several books, including one called A Million Miles in a Thousand Years that was super impactful in my own life. And we want to leave you with a quote from Donald Miller today.
Where there is an absence of story, or perhaps a bad story, a good storyteller walks in and changes reality. He doesn't critique the existing story or lament about his boredom like a critic. He just tells something different and invites other people into the new story he is telling.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of More Than Sunday. If you like the podcast, please feel free to share it. Go online and leave a comment or give us a rating so that others might hear about us. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure you also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at fumcr.com as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Len Wilson for joining us this week, and make sure you stay tuned for our Season 3 premiere coming this fall. Have a great week.